I never believed in monsters until I met Matthias. Let me tell you how it started, because the beginning is the only part of this story that still makes sense to me. Everything after that feels like a fever dream, like something that happened to someone else in another lifetime under a different name. It was October, late October, when the nights come early and the air smells like decay and possibility all at once. I had been working late at the university library, cataloging old manuscripts that no one would ever read, running my fingers over words written by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. There was something beautiful about that, I thought. Something tragic. The way we all reach out across time, desperate to be remembered, knowing that eventually we'll all be forgotten. The storm caught me by surprise. One moment the sky was that deep purple gray that comes just before darkness, and the next, the heavens opened up like someone had torn them apart. Rain came down in sheets, violent and cold, turning the streets into rivers. I ran toward the train station with my jacket pulled over my head, my shoes soaking through, my breath coming in gasps that turned to mist in the suddenly frigid air. The station platform was empty. Completely, eerily empty. The digital board flickered, showing a train that should have arrived 20 minutes ago, then 10, then 5. But the tracks remained silent. No rumble in the distance. No lights approaching through the rain. I stood there, dripping, shivering, watching the storm rage around me, and I felt it for the first time, that sensation of being watched. You know the one. That primitive instinct that makes the hair on your neck stand up, that tells you that you're prey, and somewhere nearby, something is hunting. I turned, and he was there. Matthias. Though I didn't know his name yet. Didn't know anything except that he was the most beautiful and terrifying thing I had ever seen. He stood at the edge of the platform, perfectly still in the chaos of the storm, wearing a black suit that looked like it cost more than my entire year's salary. He held an umbrella, not one of those cheap collapsible things, but a real umbrella, with a handle that gleamed like polished bone and fabric that looked like silk, like something from another era. The rain seemed to avoid him, as if even the weather knew to keep its distance. But it was his eyes that caught me. Even in the dim light of the station, even through the rain, I could see them. They were the color of storm clouds, gray and silver and dangerous, and they reflected the lightning when it flashed across the sky as if there was electricity inside him, just waiting to escape. He looked at me for a long moment, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare back at him while the rain soaked through my clothes, and my heart hammered against my ribs like something trying to escape. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not the kind of smile that puts you at ease. It was the smile of someone who knows things, secret things, dark things that you're better off not knowing. But despite that, or maybe because of it, I found myself smiling back. He approached me slowly, deliberately, moving with a grace that didn't seem quite human. When he spoke, his voice was like velvet wrapped around broken glass. He told me that the trains had stopped running, that the storm had knocked out the signals, that I'd be waiting there all night if I stayed. Then he gestured toward the street beyond the station, toward the older part of the city where the buildings crowded together like conspirators, and he said his home was just nearby, that I could wait there until the storm passed. I should have said no. Every instinct I had, every warning my mother had ever given me, every true crime podcast I'd ever listened to, every ounce of common sense I possessed screamed at me to decline politely and stay exactly where I was. But I didn't. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he could see something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Maybe it was just that I was tired of being careful, tired of making safe choices, tired of living a life that felt like I was already dead. I told him yes. He held the umbrella over both of us as we walked, though he positioned it so that I was covered, and he remained partially in the rain. I noticed, but didn't comment on it. We moved through streets I'd never seen before, even though I'd lived in this city for 3 years. The buildings grew older, more ornate, their facades carved with gargoyles and angels and faces that seemed to watch us pass. The streetlights flickered and died as we walked beneath them, plunging us into darkness for heartbeats at a time. He didn't speak, and neither did I. The only sound was the rain and the clicking of my wet shoes on the cobblestones, and the thunder rolling overhead like the world was ending. Then we stopped in front of a house that looked like it had been lifted straight out of a Gothic novel. It was tall and narrow, squeezed between two other buildings, its windows dark, its door painted black. Vines crawled up its walls like veins, and there was something about it that made my stomach twist with a mixture of dread and fascination. He produced a key from his pocket, an old key, the kind that looked more like a piece of art than a functional object, and unlocked the door. It swung open silently, revealing darkness beyond. I hesitated. He turned to look at me, and in that moment, with the lightning flashing behind him and the rain creating a curtain between us and the rest of the world, he looked like something out of a painting, something beautiful and doomed. He asked me if I was coming, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like hope, like he wanted me to say yes for reasons that had nothing to do with getting out of the storm. I stepped inside. The door closed behind us with a sound like a coffin lid, and I wondered briefly if I would ever leave. The house was exactly what you would expect and nothing like it at the same time. Yes, there were candles. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, scattered throughout the rooms, burning with flames that barely flickered. The light they cast was golden and warm, but somehow didn't quite reach the corners, leaving shadows that seemed darker than they should be. Yes, there were antiques everywhere. Furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, paintings with eyes that followed you, mirrors in ornate frames that reflected the room but made everything look slightly wrong, slightly off, like you were seeing a world parallel to this one. And yes, there was something about the place that felt frozen in time. The clocks on the walls, and there were many of them, were all stopped at the same moment. 3:47. I asked him about it, trying to sound casual, trying to pretend that my heart wasn't racing and my hands weren't shaking. He told me they had all stopped years ago, that he preferred it that way, that time was an illusion we'd all agreed to believe in, and he'd simply chosen to stop believing. I laughed nervously and said something about that being very philosophical. He didn't laugh back. He just looked at me with those storm cloud eyes and said that philosophy was just another way of hiding from the truth. He offered me tea, disappearing into a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Victorian era. I stood in his living room, dripping onto a rug that probably cost more than my car, and I tried to figure out what I'd gotten myself into. The walls were lined with books. Real books, old books, the kind with leather bindings and gold lettering. I moved closer to read the spines, and my breath caught in my throat. They were all first editions. Some of them looked centuries old. Collections of poetry by writers who died tragic deaths. Novels about doomed love affairs. Philosophy texts about the nature of existence and mortality and what it means to live forever in a world where everything ends. I pulled one from the shelf, a collection of romantic poetry, and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed but pristine, and someone had made notes in the margins in handwriting so beautiful it looked like calligraphy. The notes were in a language I didn't recognize, something that looked almost like Latin but wasn't. That was when Matthias returned with the tea. He set the tray down on a low table and watched me with an expression I couldn't read. He asked me if I liked poetry, and I told him I did, that I'd studied literature in college, that there was something about old words that made me feel connected to something larger than myself. He nodded slowly, as if I'd just confirmed something he'd suspected. Then he told me to keep the book, that it belonged with someone who would appreciate it. I tried to refuse, explaining that it must be valuable. that I couldn't possibly accept it. But he insisted, and there was something in his voice that made me stop arguing. He said that objects were only valuable if they meant something to someone, that holding on to things for their monetary worth was a kind of death, a way of preserving what should be living and breathing and shared. So I accepted it, cradling the old book like something precious and fragile. We sat together in that candlelit room, drinking tea that tasted like roses and something darker, something I couldn't identify. He asked me about my work, about the manuscripts I cataloged, about why I chose to spend my days with the words of the dead. I told him that the dead were easier than the living, that they didn't judge, didn't disappoint, didn't leave. He said he understood that better than I could possibly know. The conversation flowed easily after that, surprisingly easily. We talked about books and art and music, about the way the city had changed over the years, about loneliness and connection, and what it means to be truly known by another person. He spoke about history like he'd lived through it, describing events from centuries ago with the kind of detail that comes from first-hand experience rather than textbooks. I should have found that strange, should have questioned it, but I didn't. I was too caught up in the way he looked at me when I spoke, like every word that came out of my mouth was important, like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. Hours passed. The storm continued to rage outside, and slowly, gradually, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I hadn't seen him drink his tea, hadn't seen him eat anything. I hadn't seen him do any of the small unconscious things that humans do, scratch an itch, shift in his seat, blink more than absolutely necessary. And his skin, when I'd accidentally brushed against his hand while reaching for my cup, had been cold. Not cool. Cold. Like marble. Like something that had never known warmth. I made an excuse about needing to call someone to let them know where I was. He directed me to a phone in the hallway, an actual rotary phone, black and heavy and impossibly outdated. I picked up the receiver, but there was no dial tone. Just silence. Empty, waiting silence. When I returned to the living room, I found him standing by the window, looking out at the storm. His reflection in the glass was wrong somehow, too transparent, like he wasn't quite solid, like he was more ghost than man. I asked him if the phones were working. Without turning around, he told me they weren't, that they hadn't worked in a very long time, that he kept them because he liked the way they looked, the memories they held. Then he turned to face me, and in the candlelight, I saw something flash across his features. Something ancient. Something hungry. Something that made every cell in my body scream at me to run. But I didn't run. Instead, I asked him the question that I'd been too afraid to ask. The question that I already knew the answer to, but needed to hear out loud. I asked him what he was. The silence that followed my question seemed to stretch forever. Matthias stood there, perfectly still, watching me with those impossible eyes. The candles flickered, and for a moment, the shadows on his face made him look like something from a nightmare, all angles and darkness and barely contained violence. Then he smiled, and it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. He told me I should leave. Told me that the storm was dying down and I could make it home if I left right now. Told me that some questions were better left unasked, some doors better left unopened, some truths better left in the darkness where they belonged. But I couldn't leave. Not now. Not when I was this close to understanding the thing that I'd felt the moment I saw him. That strange mixture of terror and recognition, like looking into a mirror and seeing something that was both you and not you, familiar and alien all at once. I told him I wasn't going anywhere until he answered me. I heard the tremor in my own voice, felt the way my hands were shaking, but I stood my ground. I'd spent my whole life being careful, being safe, being the kind of person who never took risks or pushed boundaries or demanded answers. But something about this moment, about him, made me brave in a way I'd never been before. He studied me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options, deciding whether to tell me the truth or craft a lie that would send me running. Then finally he moved to the fireplace and spoke with his back to me, his voice low and controlled, like he was confessing to a priest. He told me he'd been alive for a very long time. Not living alive was the wrong word, but existing, persisting, enduring. He told me about the night he changed centuries ago, when someone like him had found him dying on a battlefield and offered him a choice, death or something else. Something that looked like life, but was really just an eternal postponement of the inevitable. He spoke about the years that followed, the decades that turned into centuries, the way everyone he'd ever known had aged and died while he remained exactly as he was. He described the loneliness of it, the way it felt to watch the world change while you stayed frozen. Like being trapped in amber, like being a ghost in your own existence. He talked about the hunger, and he was honest about this, brutally honest, the way it burned inside him, constant and demanding, the way he'd learned to control it but never could truly eliminate it. He explained that he fed but tried to be careful about it, taking only what he needed, never killing, never turning anyone else into what he was. He said he'd made that mistake once, long ago, and the guilt of it had haunted him for more years than I'd been alive. As he spoke, I watched his reflection in the window above the fireplace. It was there, but faint, like a watermark on paper, like he was only partially present in the world, like he existed in the space between life and death, belonging fully to neither. When he finished, he turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that I hadn't expected: vulnerability, fear. The look of someone who had just exposed his deepest wound and was waiting to see if it would be rejected or accepted. He asked me if I was afraid. I was. Of course I was. Terror was coursing through my veins, making my heart race, making every instinct scream at me to get out, to run, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this beautiful monster. But underneath the fear was something else. Something I couldn't quite name. Something that felt dangerously like understanding, like compassion, like the recognition of a kindred spirit. I told him I was afraid, but not in the way he probably thought. I explained that I was afraid of what it meant that I wasn't running, that I wasn't screaming. That part of me wanted to stay in this strange house with its stopped clocks and perpetual candles, and the man, the creature, who looked at me like I was both salvation and damnation. He laughed then, a short, bitter sound that held no joy. He said I was either the bravest or the most foolish person he'd ever met, and he wasn't sure which was worse. Then he moved toward the door and opened it, gesturing for me to leave, insisting that I had to go now, before something happened that couldn't be undone. But I didn't move. I stood there in his living room, surrounded by his books and his memories and his centuries of loneliness, and I made a decision that would change everything. I told him no. I told him I wanted to stay. Not just for tonight, not just until the storm ended, but really stay. I wanted to know him. I wanted to understand what it meant to exist outside of time, to carry that kind of weight, to live in the spaces between human understanding. He stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. He explained all the reasons why this was impossible, why it would never work, why I would come to regret this decision. He reminded me that he was dangerous, that the hunger never truly went away, that there would be nights when he would look at me and see me as something other than a person, see me as sustenance, as survival, as the thing his nature demanded. I heard him. I understood him. And I stayed anyway. Because here's what I'd realized, standing in that room with this impossible being. I'd been dead long before I met him. I'd been going through the motions of life, cataloging the words of ghosts, existing in the past because the present felt too empty, too meaningless, too safe. Meeting Matthias had woken something in me, something I thought had died years ago, the capacity to feel, to want, to choose something dangerous and unknown over something safe and predictable. So I stayed, and in staying, I sealed my fate. The first weeks were strange, beautiful and terrible and strange. Matthias tried to maintain distance. He would disappear for hours, sometimes entire nights, and when he returned, his eyes would be darker, his movements more fluid, and I would know that he'd fed. We didn't talk about it. We'd established that boundary early on. Don't ask, don't tell, because some things were too intimate, too raw, to put into words. But when he was there, when he was with me, it was like nothing I'd ever experienced. We would sit in his library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, and he would read to me in languages I didn't understand, Latin and Greek and French, and something he said was Proto-Germanic, a language that hadn't been spoken in over 1,000 years. His voice would wrap around the foreign words, making them sound like music, like prayers, like incantations. I learned about his past in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that would never be complete. He told me about the Crusades, about the Black Death, about revolutions and wars and empires that rose and fell like waves. He spoke about the people he'd known, artists and philosophers and kings, describing them with such vivid detail that they came alive in my imagination. But he rarely spoke about his feelings. He kept that part of himself locked away, buried under centuries of carefully constructed walls. I could see it sometimes, though, in unguarded moments. The way he would watch me when he thought I wasn't looking, with an expression that mixed longing and sorrow and something that looked dangerously like hope. I was falling for him. How could I not be? He was everything I'd ever wanted and everything I should have feared. He was poetry made flesh, darkness wrapped in beauty, danger disguised as salvation. Every conversation with him felt like discovering a new world. Every moment in his presence felt more real than anything I'd experienced in my entire ordinary life. In falling for someone like Matthias was like falling into a well. You didn't know how deep it was until you were too far down to climb back out. The first time he really touched me, was on a night when the city was blanketed in snow. I'd been living in his house for almost a month by then, sleeping in one of his many spare bedrooms, existing in a strange liminal space where I was neither guest nor resident, neither friend nor something more. We were in the library, and I was reading one of his books, a collection of love letters written between two poets in the 18th century. The letters were heartbreaking, full of longing and frustration and the particular agony of loving someone you couldn't have. I'd been crying without realizing it, tears sliding down my cheeks as I read about desire constrained by circumstance, about hearts that wanted to merge but were kept forever separate. Matthias had been sitting across from me, pretending to read, but I knew he was watching. When he saw the tears, something shifted in his expression. He set down his book and crossed the room in that unnaturally fluid way he had, moving like silk, like smoke, like a predator trying to appear harmless. He sat beside me on the couch, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from his body, close enough that I could see the fine details of his face, the impossibly smooth skin, the lips that were just slightly too pale, the eyes that held centuries of secrets. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and brushed the tears from my cheek with his thumb. His touch was cold, so cold, but it sent electricity racing through my entire body. I gasped and he froze, his hand still cupped against my face, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He asked me why I was crying, and I told him about the letters, about the lovers who could never be together. I said something about how tragic it was, how unfair, how love should be enough but never is. His hand was still on my face, his thumb tracing the path my tears had taken. He told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that some love stories weren't meant to have happy endings. He said that sometimes the tragedy was the point, that the impossibility was what made it beautiful. Then he leaned in, and I hoped he was going to kiss me. But he stopped, so close that I could feel his breath on my lips, cold and smelling faintly of something sweet and metallic. He stayed there, frozen, his forehead almost touching mine, his eyes closed like he was in pain. He said my name. Vivian. He'd learned my name that first night. But this was the first time he'd said it like that, like it was something precious, like it was a prayer and a curse all at once. Then he pulled back abruptly, standing up so quickly that he was across the room before I could even process what had happened. He told me he couldn't, that I deserved someone who could give me a normal life, someone who wouldn't drag me into darkness. But what he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that I didn't want normal. I'd had normal. Normal was lonely. Normal was empty. Normal was existing without living, going through the motions without ever feeling truly alive. With him, I felt alive. Dangerously, impossibly, terrifyingly alive. I told him this, standing up to face him across the room. I told him that I wasn't some fragile thing that needed protecting, that I'd made my choice with open eyes, that I wanted this, wanted him, regardless of the consequences. His expression was anguished, torn between desire and something that looked like self-hatred. He told me I didn't understand what I was asking for, what it would mean to tie myself to something like him. He described the darkness that lived inside him, the hunger that never slept, the moments when he had to fight every instinct to keep from hurting the people he cared about. But the more he tried to push me away, the more I understood him, because I had my own darkness, my own hunger, my own moments when I felt like something vital was missing, like I was a ghost walking through a world of solid things. We stood there in silence, the library around us full of books about impossible loves and tragic endings, and I realized something that should have terrified me, but instead filled me with a strange kind of peace. We were the same, he and I. Different species maybe, different natures, but the same in all the ways that mattered. Both lonely, both searching, both desperate for connection in a world that seemed designed to keep us separate. I crossed the room to him, closing the distance he'd tried to create. He watched me approach like I was something dangerous, like I was the monster and he was the human, and maybe in that moment, he was right. I took his hand, his cold, unnaturally perfect hand, and I held it against my chest, right over my heart, so he could feel it beating. I told him that this was what he was afraid of, this pulse, this warmth, this fragile human life that would inevitably end. I told him I understood his fear, understood why he'd spent centuries avoiding attachment, avoiding the pain of watching everything he loved turn to dust. But I also told him that fear wasn't a good enough reason to refuse to live, that existing wasn't the same as living, that safety wasn't the same as happiness, that protecting yourself from pain also meant protecting yourself from joy. His hand was still pressed against my heart, and I could see the conflict raging behind his eyes. Centuries of self-preservation warring with something newer, something he'd been trying to suppress since the night we met. Then, finally, he surrendered. He kissed me, and it was nothing like I'd imagined. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate and hungry and profound, like he was trying to consume me, to pull me into himself, to merge us into a single being. His lips were cold, but his kiss was burning, paradox made physical. And I understood in that moment why people wrote sonnets about desire, why they went mad for it, why they destroyed themselves for one more taste of this feeling. His hands were in my hair, on my face, tracing the line of my spine, and everywhere he touched felt like it was both freezing and on fire. I pressed myself against him, trying to get closer, closer, impossibly closer, trying to eliminate the space between us that felt like a chasm. When we finally broke apart, both breathless, though he didn't need to breathe, I realized he was just mimicking me. His eyes had changed. The gray had darkened to almost black, and there was something in them that wasn't quite human, something ancient and powerful and barely restrained. He told me, his voice rough and strained, that he should stop, that this was dangerous, that I had no idea what I was inviting, but I did know. Oh, I knew exactly what I was inviting, and I wanted it anyway. I told him to stop protecting me from himself. I told him I wasn't afraid of his darkness, of his hunger, of his nature. I told him that I'd rather have one real moment with him than a lifetime of safe, careful, ordinary moments with someone else. Something, in my words, broke the last of his resistance. I saw it happen, saw the moment when centuries of self-denial crumbled away, leaving only want and need and a hunger that had nothing to do with blood. He kissed me again, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back, no pretending that this wasn't exactly what we both wanted, what we both needed, what we'd both been circling around since that first night in the rain. The library faded away. The books and candles and stopped clocks became irrelevant. There was only this, his hands on me, my hands on him, the impossible coldness of his skin against my warmth, the way he whispered my name like it was the only word that mattered. We didn't sleep together that night. He explained later that there were limits to what he could safely do, boundaries he couldn't cross without risking my life, but what we did was more intimate than any physical act could have been. We laid together in the darkness, him holding me like I was something precious and breakable, me listening to the silence where his heartbeat should have been, and we talked until the sun started to rise. He told me things he'd never told anyone, about the loneliness that felt like it would never end, about the guilt of surviving when everyone else died, about the moments when he'd considered letting himself walk into the sun, ending an existence that felt more like a punishment than a gift. I told him about my own loneliness, different but no less profound, about feeling like I was watching life happen from behind a window, never quite able to break through and participate, about the certainty that I would never find anyone who understood me, who saw me as something more than just another ordinary person living an ordinary life. As dawn approached, I watched him grow still, more like a statue than a man. His skin took on an even paler quality, if that was possible, and his breathing, already so faint, stopped entirely. He told me he had to sleep, that the daylight would force him into a state very close to death, that he would be completely vulnerable. He asked me, with something that looked like fear in his eyes, if I would stay with him, if I would guard him while he was helpless, if I would be there when he woke. I promised I would, and I meant it. I watched the sun rise through the heavy curtains of his bedroom, casting thin lines of light across the floor that stopped just short of where he lay. He was perfectly still, barely even looking alive, and I understood for the first time the true nature of what he was. Not quite dead, but not quite alive. Suspended in the space between, belonging fully to neither state. I should have been afraid, should have taken the opportunity to leave, to run, to return to my normal life and pretend this had all been a strange dream. But instead, I lay down beside him, careful not to let the sunlight touch him. And I watched him sleep his death-like sleep, and I felt more at peace than I'd ever felt in my entire life. This was where I belonged, with him, in the darkness, on the edge of the impossible, even if it destroyed me. The weeks that followed existed outside of normal time. Days blurred into nights, blurred into days again. I stopped going to work, stopped answering my phone, stopped maintaining contact with the outside world. It was just us, existing in that strange house with its stopped clocks, living a life that had no reference point in the normal human experience. Matthias was different after that night. The walls he'd built around himself had crumbled, and what emerged was someone both more and less human than the careful persona he'd maintained. He was tender with me in ways that broke my heart, touching me like I might shatter, looking at me like he couldn't quite believe I was real, saying my name in the darkness like a talisman against loneliness. But there was also a darkness that he couldn't hide anymore. Moments when his eyes would track my movement across a room with an intensity that had nothing to do with affection. Nights when he would disappear for hours and return with a haunted look, his lips slightly redder, his movements more fluid, his eyes refusing to meet mine. We didn't talk about those moments. We existed around them, creating a careful choreography of what we would acknowledge and what we would ignore. He taught me about his world, the hidden world that existed alongside humanity but separate from it. He explained that there were others like him, scattered across the world, most of them much older, much more dangerous, much less concerned with morality or human life. He told me about the rules they followed, unwritten but absolute. Codes of conduct that kept them from exposing themselves, from creating too many of their kind, from drawing attention. He told me he'd broken one of those rules by letting me know what he was, that if others of his kind found out, there would be consequences. That knowledge was dangerous, that it made me a target, that keeping me safe now required a level of vigilance he hadn't needed in centuries. I asked him why he'd told me then, if it was so dangerous. Why he hadn't just compelled me to forget, to leave, to return to my normal life with no memory of him or his house, or that night in the rain. He said it was because he'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be known. And when I'd asked him what he was, when I'd stood there and demanded the truth instead of running, he'd realized that loneliness was more dangerous than any external threat. That he would rather risk everything than spend another century hiding, pretending, existing in the shadows without anyone to share the darkness with. His honesty devastated me in the best and worst ways. It made me love him more deeply and more desperately than I'd ever loved anyone. And it made me understand, with terrible clarity, that this story could only end one way. But I didn't let myself think about endings. Not yet. I was too caught up in the present, in the strange beauty of our existence, in the way he would read poetry to me in dead languages, in the way he would show me paintings he'd watched being created, in the way he would describe historical events with the kind of detail that only came from having been there. He took me out sometimes, always at night, always to places where we wouldn't be seen, hidden gardens where only the homeless and the desperate went, abandoned buildings where he'd lived centuries ago, now crumbling and forgotten. Cemeteries where he would show me the graves of people he'd known, loved, lost. One night, he took me to an old church that had been converted into a bookstore, who wandered through the aisles surrounded by thousands of books, and he would occasionally pull one down and tell me about the author, about meeting them at a party in Paris or Vienna or London, about conversations they'd had, about promises made and broken. That was the night I understood the true weight of his existence. Not just the years, but the accumulation of loss. Every person he'd known was dead. Every place he'd loved was changed or destroyed. Every moment of joy was tainted by the knowledge that it couldn't last, that everything beautiful was temporary, that he would outlive every single thing he cared about. I asked him how he bore it, how he kept going when everything was so impermanent, so fragile, so doomed to end. He looked at me with those storm cloud eyes, and he said that you learned to love things because they ended, not despite it. That permanence was the enemy of meaning. That if he could keep anything forever, it would lose its value, become just another object in a house full of centuries of accumulated things. Then he kissed me there, in the religious studies section of that converted church, surrounded by books about faith and eternity, and I tasted the salt of my own tears in his cold mouth. That was when I started to understand what he'd been trying to tell me from the beginning, that loving him was a kind of suicide. Not physical, he would never hurt me, I was certain of that, but emotional, spiritual, existential. Loving someone who couldn't age while I grew older every day was choosing grief, choosing loss, choosing to watch myself become something he would eventually lose or have to leave behind. But I chose it anyway, because the alternative, a safe life without him, felt like a different kind of death, a slower death. A death that happened one day at a time in the space between heartbeats, in the gray area where nothing truly terrible happened, but nothing truly wonderful did either. I'd rather burn bright and brief than fade slowly into nothing. The first time we fought was about time. It was late February, and I'd been living with him for almost 4 months. I'd stopped pretending I had any other life, stopped maintaining the fiction that this was temporary, that I would eventually return to normalcy. My apartment was still there, still full of my things, but I hadn't been back in weeks. It existed like a museum to a person I used to be, a person who seemed increasingly foreign to me. Matthias had been distant that night. Not cold exactly, but removed, like he was watching me from a great distance even though we were in the same room. I could feel him pulling away, could sense him building those walls again, and I didn't understand why. Finally, I confronted him. I asked him what was wrong, what had changed, why he was looking at me like I was already a ghost. He was quiet for a long time, standing by the window, looking out at the frozen city. Then he told me that I needed to leave. Not forever, he said, but for a while. Weeks, maybe months. He said I needed to remember what normal life felt like, needed to reconnect with the world I'd left behind, needed to understand what I was giving up before I gave it up completely. I was furious. I demanded to know why he was pushing me away, why he was making decisions for me like I was a child who couldn't understand the consequences of my own choices. He turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Desperation. He told me that I was getting older, not much months, not years, but enough that he could see it. A line here that hadn't been there before. A slightly different quality to my skin. The inevitable march of time that he'd long ago escaped but I was still subject to. He said he was watching me age in real time, watching the clock tick down on something precious and fragile, and he couldn't bear it. He'd thought he could love me and let me go when the time came, but he'd been wrong. The reality of my mortality was crushing him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Then he said something that broke my heart. He told me he was starting to think about turning me, about offering me what had been offered to him centuries ago, about making me into something like him so we could exist together outside of time, but he couldn't do it. He told me about the person he'd turned, centuries ago, in a moment of weakness and loneliness. How they'd hated what they'd become, how they'd blamed him for taking their humanity, how they'd eventually walked into the sun rather than continue existing in that state, how their death had haunted him for longer than I'd been alive. He said he couldn't risk that with me, couldn't risk me hating him for transforming me, couldn't risk taking away my humanity and my choice, and my mortality. But he also couldn't bear to watch me age and die, so he needed me to leave. To give him space to figure out how to love someone temporary, how to accept that this would end, how to let go before the ending destroyed him. I understood what he was saying, understood the impossible position he was in, but I was also angry that he was making this decision alone. Angry that he was trying to protect me from my own choices. Angry that he assumed he knew what was best for me better than I did. I told him that I didn't care about aging, that I wasn't afraid of dying, that every moment with him was worth whatever price I'd have to pay later. I told him that he was being a coward, that he was running away from connection because he was afraid of loss, that he was choosing loneliness over love because loneliness was safer. He flinched at that, like I'd struck him, and for a moment, I saw the raw pain beneath his careful control. He told me I didn't understand, that I couldn't possibly understand what it was like to watch everyone you love turn to dust, to exist in a world where you were the only constant and everything else was temporary. But I did understand. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not with the same depth of experience. But I understood the fear of loss, the terror of attachment, the temptation to choose isolation over the risk of heartbreak. I told him that understanding and accepting were different things, that I understood his fear, but I didn't accept his solution, that pushing me away wouldn't protect either of us, it would just make us both lonely again. We stood there, facing each other across that beautiful, terrible room, and I saw the moment when something in him broke. When the centuries of careful control crumbled, and what emerged was just pain, raw and desperate and overwhelming. He told me he loved me. It was the first time he'd said it out loud, and it sounded like a confession and an accusation all at once. He said he'd tried not to, tried to keep his distance, tried to maintain the walls that had protected him for so long. But I'd broken through somehow, had found my way past every defense, and now he was ruined for anyone else, anything else, any other way of existing. He said loving me was the best and worst thing that had ever happened to him in his entire, impossible, endless life. I crossed the room to him and I took his face in my hands, his cold, perfect, tragic face, and I told him that I loved him too, that I'd loved him since that first night in the rain, maybe even before that, in some way that transcended logic and sense. That loving him felt like recognizing something I'd always known, like coming home to a place I'd never been. I told him that we couldn't control how this ended, but we could control how we existed in the time we had. That we could choose fear, or we could choose love. And I was choosing love, even knowing what it would cost. He kissed me then, and it was different from all the other times. There is surrender in it, acceptance, a letting go of the careful control he'd maintained. His hands were in my hair, on my face, pulling me closer like he could merge us into a single being, like he could stop time through sheer force of will. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, and he told me he would try. He couldn't promise he wouldn't panic again, couldn't promise he wouldn't struggle with watching me age, couldn't promise this would be easy. But he would try to stay, to be present, to love me as a mortal instead of wishing I was something else. It wasn't a perfect resolution, we both knew that. But it was honest, and it was real, and it was all we had. So we held each other in that room full of stopped clocks and perpetual candles. And we chose to exist together in the face of impossible odds. And we pretended that love might be enough. Spring came to the city, bringing with it life and color and the kind of warmth that made everything feel possible. Matthias struggled with the longer days. The sun stayed up later, which meant less time when he could move freely, when he could exist in the world without discomfort. He became more nocturnal than before, sleeping through most of the daylight hours, waking only as the sun set and the shadows lengthened. I adjusted my life to match his. Slept during the day, woke at dusk, lived in the blue hours between sunset and sunrise. I became a creature of darkness, not because I had to be, but because I wanted to be. Because that was where he existed, and I wanted to exist beside him. We developed routines, small domestic things that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. He would wake first, always, his eyes opening the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. I would feel him leave the bed. He'd started sleeping beside me, even though he didn't actually need sleep. just lying there in that death-like stillness while I slept, and I would wake to find him standing by the window, watching the night emerge. I would join him there, and he would put his arm around me, pulling me against his cold side, and we would watch the city lights flicker on like stars being born. He would point out buildings that hadn't existed when he'd arrived in the city, areas that had been farmland or forest or empty space. He'd tell me stories about the city's past, about people and events that had long since faded from official history. And I would add those stories to the collection I was building in my mind, cataloging his memories the way I used to catalog manuscripts. We would make tea for me, not him, and we would sit in his library, reading companionably, occasionally sharing passages that struck us. He introduced me to writers I'd never heard of, poets whose work had been lost to time, philosophers whose ideas had been suppressed or forgotten. His library was like an alternate history of human thought, full of voices that had been silenced but that he'd preserved, kept alive through his memory and his collection. Sometimes we would go out, always after dark, always to places where we wouldn't be noticed. We'd walk through the city streets, and he'd show me layers of history that most people never saw. A cornerstone from a building that had burned down in 1888. A plaque commemorating a massacre that history books rarely mentioned. A tree that was older than the city itself, that had witnessed everything and remembered nothing. He moved through the world like a ghost, like someone who was there but not there, present but not quite real. And I moved beside him, becoming ghost-like myself, learning to see the city the way he saw it as a palimpsest. Layer upon layer of history and memory and change, each version of the city existing simultaneously if you knew how to look. Those were good weeks. Beautiful weeks. Weeks when I could almost forget that this was temporary, that I was aging and he wasn't. That time was moving for me in a way it no longer moved for him. But there were harder moments too. Times when I would catch him staring at me with an expression that was equal parts love and grief. Like he was already mourning me, even though I was right there, alive, present, real. Times when he would disappear for entire nights, returning with that haunted look, that guilty expression, the signs of having fed written in the darkness of his eyes and the slight color in his lips. Times when I would look in the mirror and see the subtle changes he'd mentioned, a line here, a different quality to my skin there, and I would understand, with terrible clarity, that this was the beginning of the end. Not the end itself, not yet, but the start of the slow decline that would eventually separate us completely. Those moments terrified me in ways I couldn't articulate. Not because I was afraid of age. Everyone aged, everyone died. It was the natural order of things, but because I was afraid of losing him. Of the moment when he would look at me and see a stranger instead of the person he loved. Of the day when he would have to let me go. But I didn't tell him about these fears. We had an unspoken agreement not to talk about the future, not to project forward into the inevitable tragedy that awaited us. We existed in the present, moment by moment, night by night, trying to make each one count. The change happened gradually, so gradually that I didn't notice it at first. Matthias started pulling away again, not dramatically, but subtly. He would be present, but distant. There, but not quite there, like part of him was somewhere else. Our conversations became shorter, more surface level. The intimate moments became less frequent. The way he looked at me changed, less like a lover, more like someone studying a problem they couldn't solve. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend everything was fine, but the distance grew like a cancer, invisible but deadly, eating away at the connection we'd built. Finally, on a night in late May when the air was warm and heavy with the promise of summer, I confronted him again. We were in his library, surrounded by books, and the silence between us had grown oppressive. I asked him what was happening, why he was disappearing even when he was right there in front of me. He was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on a book in his lap that I knew he wasn't actually reading. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said he was starting to see me as food, not constantly, not even frequently, but in moments when his control wavered, when the hunger became too strong. When he looked at me and the first thing he noticed wasn't my eyes or my smile, but the pulse in my throat. The blood moving beneath my skin, the fragility of my human body. He told me it horrified him, that he'd never looked at me that way before, that something had shifted in his perception and he didn't know how to shift it back. He said he was terrified that one night, in a moment of weakness, he would lose control and hurt me. That the thing he'd been so certain he could resist was becoming harder and harder to fight. He said he thought maybe we'd been wrong to try this, wrong to think that love could override nature, wrong to believe that he could exist in close proximity to a human to me without eventually seeing me as prey. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. All the air left my lungs, and for a moment I couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there and process what he'd just told me. Part of me wanted to run, to pack my things and leave and never look back, to return to my normal life and pretend this had all been a nightmare. Because what he was describing, seeing me as food, was exactly what every survival instinct I possessed told me to fear. But a larger part of me understood something he couldn't see. He'd told me. He hadn't hidden it, hadn't pretended everything was fine, hadn't waited until something terrible happened. He'd been honest, vulnerable, had exposed his darkest fear and his greatest shame because he cared more about my safety than his pride. I asked him if he wanted to hurt me, if there was any part of him that actually desired to feed from me, to harm me, to take what his nature demanded. He looked at me with anguished eyes and said, no. That the thought repulsed him, that even in moments when the hunger was strongest, the idea of hurting me was unbearable. But he didn't trust that no would always be enough. Didn't trust that his control would hold forever. Didn't trust that his love for me was stronger than his nature. I understood then what was happening. It wasn't that he was losing control. It was that he was so afraid of losing control that he was seeing danger everywhere, with catastrophizing every moment of hunger into a potential tragedy. I told him that fear wasn't the same as danger, that being aware of the risk wasn't the same as succumbing to it, that the fact that he was so terrified of hurting me was proof that he wouldn't, that his fear was actually his protection, the thing that would keep both of us safe. But he shook his head, and I could see that my words weren't reaching him. He'd made up his mind, constructed a narrative where the only safe option was distance, separation, ending things before something irreparable happened. He told me I needed to leave. Not for a while this time, but for good. He said he loved me too much to risk my life, that every additional day we spent together was another chance for something to go wrong, that he couldn't bear the thought of being the one who destroyed me. I felt something break inside me then. Not dramatically, not with a snap or a crash, but quietly, like ice fracturing beneath weight, spreading outward in invisible lines until the whole structure was compromised. I asked him if this was really what he wanted, or if he was just running away again, choosing loneliness over risk, isolation over love. He told me it didn't matter what he wanted, that what he wanted was irrelevant in the face of what was safe, what was right, what would keep me alive and human and free from the darkness that defined his existence. I wanted to argue more, wanted to fight, wanted to make him see that he was wrong, that we could navigate this together, that love was worth the risk. But I looked at his face and saw a certainty there that I couldn't shake. He'd made his choice. Not out of lack of love, but out of too much of it. He was saving me the only way he knew how, by letting me go. So I did what he asked. I gathered my few possessions, moving through his house like a ghost, touching things one last time, trying to memorize every detail because I knew I would never be here again. He watched me from the doorway, and I could see that this was destroying him as much as it was destroying me. But he didn't stop me, didn't change his mind, didn't beg me to stay. When I reached the front door, the same door I'd walked through months ago, soaking wet and naive and unprepared for everything that would follow, I turned back to look at him one more time. He stood in the shadows of his house, surrounded by his centuries of accumulated objects and memories and loneliness, and he looked more lost than I'd ever seen him. I told him I loved him, that I would always love him, that I understood why he was doing this, even though I hated it, that he wasn't a monster, wasn't dangerous, wasn't the thing he feared he was. He didn't respond, just stood there, silent, watching me with those storm cloud eyes that held so much pain, I could barely stand to look at them. So I left, walked out into the night, into the warm May air that smelled like flowers and possibility, and I didn't look back. Because if I'd looked back, I would have seen what I already knew, that we were both losing something irreplaceable, that this separation was protecting no one, that fear was stealing from us the only thing that had ever made his endless existence bearable. But I didn't look back. I just walked, one foot in front of the other, moving away from the house and the man and the impossible love that had briefly made me feel like I was living instead of just existing. The weeks after I left were the worst of my life. I returned to my apartment, to my normal life, to the job I'd been neglecting and the routines I'd abandoned. Everything looked the same as I'd left it, but I felt like a different person. Like I'd been replaced by a version of myself that no longer quite fit into this ordinary existence. I tried to move on, tried to fall back into the rhythms of normal human life. Went to work, came home, ate food that tasted like nothing, slept in a bed that felt too warm and too empty. I avoided the streets near his house, avoided anything that might remind me of him. Avoided even thinking his name, because thinking his name made my chest ache with a physical pain that I couldn't alleviate. But moving on was impossible, because I'd tasted something different, something rare, something that most people never experienced. I'd known what it felt like to be truly seen, truly understood, truly loved by someone who'd existed long enough to know the difference between infatuation and real connection. Going back to ordinary life after that felt like being buried alive. I lost weight, stopped sleeping properly, moved through my days like a ghost, present but not present, existing but not living. My coworkers noticed but didn't ask, probably assuming I'd gone through a bad breakup, which was technically true, but didn't begin to cover the reality of what I'd lost. At night, I would lie awake and think about him, about what he was doing, whether he was suffering the way I was suffering, whether he regretted his decision or was relieved to be free of the burden of my mortality. I would remember the way he'd said my name, the way he'd touched me like I was something precious, the way he'd looked at me like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking for centuries. And I would hate him for sending me away, and love him for doing it out of fear for my safety, and hate myself for leaving, and love myself for respecting his wishes, until all the emotions tangled together into something I couldn't name or understand. It was late June when I saw him again. I hadn't meant to. I'd been careful to avoid his neighborhood, to take different routes home, to stay away from anything that might bring us into contact. But that night, I'd been working late again, falling back into old patterns, using work as a distraction from the emptiness that had become my constant companion. The train was delayed déjà vu, I thought bitterly, and I decided to walk instead. I didn't consciously choose the route that would take me past his street. Or maybe I did. Maybe some part of me was still hoping, still looking for one more glimpse of the life I'd been forced to leave behind. I saw him on a corner 3 blocks from his house. He wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, young, beautiful, dressed in clothes that looked expensive and carefully chosen. She was laughing at something he'd said, touching his arm in a way that made my stomach twist with jealousy and grief, and something that felt terribly like betrayal. I stopped walking, couldn't move, could barely breathe. Just stood there, frozen, watching this scene that confirmed every fear I'd been carrying since the night I left. He'd moved on, found someone else. Someone who probably didn't know what he was, who was falling into the same trap I'd fallen into, who would eventually be hurt the same way I'd been hurt. Or maybe she was different. Maybe she was what I couldn't be, content with the surface, happy with the mystery. Someone who wouldn't push for truth or demand real intimacy or make him confront the things he was afraid to confront. I should have looked away, should have kept walking. Should have let them have their moment without my observation, my judgment, my pain. But I couldn't move. I was trapped there, watching, and then he saw me. Our eyes met across the distance, and I saw something flash across his face. Surprise, pain, something that might have been relief or might have been regret. The woman beside him was still talking, oblivious to the moment happening between us. And he wasn't listening to her at all. He was just looking at me with an expression that told me everything I needed to know. He hadn't moved on. He was pretending, performing, going through the motions of existing without actually living, the same way I'd been doing since I left. The woman followed his gaze, saw me standing there, and her expression changed. She asked him something. I was too far away to hear, and he shook his head, said something that made her frown, then made some excuse and walked away. He started moving toward me, and I should have run, should have turned and disappeared before he could reach me, before he could say anything that would make this harder than it already was. But I didn't run. I stood there and watched him approach, and when he stopped in front of me, close enough to touch but not touching, I could see that he looked terrible. Not physically, he never looked anything less than perfect, but in his eyes, in the way he held himself, in the subtle signs that someone who knew him well would recognize. He said my name, Vivian, like a prayer, like a wound, like something he'd been holding inside for so long that letting it out caused physical pain. I asked him who she was, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound jealous or hurt or desperate. He told me she was no one, a woman he'd met at a gallery opening, someone who'd been pursuing him, someone he'd agreed to see because he thought it might help him forget, might make the loneliness bearable, might prove that he could exist with someone else. Then he told me it hadn't worked, that every moment with her just made him miss me more, made him realize that what we'd had wasn't replaceable, wasn't something he could find with anyone else. He said he'd been wrong. That sending me away hadn't made either of us safer, it had just made us both miserable. That fear had stolen from us the only thing that mattered. That he'd been a coward, and he was sorry. And he understood if I hated him, but he needed me to know that leaving me was the biggest mistake of his long, regret-filled existence. I stood there, listening to this confession, and I felt something inside me shift. Not healing exactly. The wound was still there, still raw, but something like the possibility of healing. The sense that maybe this story didn't have to end the way we'd both feared. I told him I didn't hate him, that I understood why he'd done what he'd done, even if I didn't agree with it. That I'd been miserable too, that these weeks apart had been a kind of death, that I'd been going through the motions of living without actually feeling alive. Then I asked him the question that mattered most. Had anything actually changed? Was he still afraid of hurting me? Was he still seeing me as food in moments of weakness? Was being apart from me for these weeks enough to resolve the thing that had driven us apart in the first place? He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with how to answer, weighing honesty against hope. Finally, he told me the truth. He said the fear was still there, that it probably always would be, that loving a mortal as an immortal meant living with the constant awareness of fragility and danger and the potential for tragedy. But he'd also realized something, that fear wasn't the problem, that trying to eliminate risk wasn't the same as choosing safety, that the real danger wasn't his nature or my mortality or the hunger he sometimes felt. It was letting fear make decisions for us, letting it steal the present in the name of protecting a future that might never come. He said he wanted to try again if I would have him. He couldn't promise it would be perfect, couldn't promise there wouldn't be difficult moments, couldn't promise that we wouldn't face all the same challenges that had driven us apart. But he could promise to be honest, to communicate, to work through the fear instead of running from it. He could promise that he would fight for us, for this impossible connection, for the chance to exist together for whatever time we had. He asked me if that was enough, if the possibility of something beautiful and tragic and real was worth the certainty of eventual loss. I looked at him standing there in the summer night, this impossible being who'd shown me what it meant to truly live, and I knew there was only one answer I could give. I told him yes. We went back to his house together that night, and it felt like coming home. Nothing had changed physically. The same stopped clocks, the same perpetual candles, the same library full of centuries of accumulated knowledge. But something had changed between us. We'd been broken and had chosen to put ourselves back together, and the cracks where we'd fractured made us stronger rather than weaker. We talked through the night, really talked about fears and boundaries and what we both needed to make this work. He explained the patterns he'd noticed in his hunger, the times when it was strongest, the signs that meant he needed to feed before seeing me. I told him about my fears too, not of him hurting me physically, but of him pulling away emotionally, of him deciding again that I was better off without him, of him choosing my theoretical safety over our real connection. We made agreements, rules that would help us navigate the impossible terrain of our relationship. He would feed regularly, proactively, before the hunger became overwhelming. He would tell me when he was struggling instead of pulling away. He would trust that I was making informed choices about my own life, that I understood the risks and accepted them. I agreed to respect his boundaries, to not push him to turn me, even though part of me still wondered what it would be like to exist as he did. I agreed to be honest about my own fears, to communicate instead of assuming, to remember that his caution came from love rather than lack of it. And we agreed, most importantly, to exist in the present, to stop projecting into a future we couldn't control, to stop letting the inevitability of loss steal the joy of now, to love each other fiercely and completely for whatever time we had, whether that was years or decades or just days. As dawn approached and he began to fade into that death-like sleep, he pulled me close and told me something I'll never forget. He said that in all his centuries of existence, in all the years and decades and lifetimes he'd lived through, these months with me had been the only time he'd felt truly alive. That I'd given him something he'd thought was lost forever. Hope. Connection. The sense that existence was about more than just enduring. He said that however this ended, whether in months or years or decades, it would be worth it. That loving me had reminded him why immortality was a gift rather than a curse, why existence mattered, why he'd chosen to keep going all those times when giving up would have been easier. I held him as he slept, watching the sun rise and cast its dangerous light across the floor. And I understood something profound. We were both mortal in our own ways. He would outlive me by centuries, but he was still subject to time, still vulnerable to loss, still capable of being hurt and broken and destroyed by love. The difference between us wasn't mortality, it was just scale. And in the grand scheme of the universe, in the vast expanse of eternity, Our time together, whether 50 years or 50 months, was equally brief, equally precious, equally meaningful. So I chose to love him without fear, to exist beside him in the darkness without counting the days, to build something beautiful and temporary and real. Because isn't that what all love is, really? A conscious choice to care for something that won't last forever? A rebellion against the inevitability of endings? A way of saying that meaning matters more than permanence. That connection is worth the price of eventual separation. That being fully alive, even briefly, is better than being safely numb forever? I'm writing this now, months later in the early morning hours while he sleeps beside me. The sun is rising outside, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And I can hear the city waking up, cars starting, people walking, life continuing in that ordinary, beautiful way it does. Matthias is still beside me, looking like a sculpture, like something carved from marble, like death made beautiful. I should be afraid, but I'm not. The fear is of the day, not the night. The fear is of ordinary existence, not extraordinary love. The fear is of playing it safe and dying anyway, having never really lived. I don't know how this story ends. I know it will, and all stories do. All loves do. All lives do. But I don't know when or how or what it will feel like when it finally comes. What I know is this. Right now, in this moment, I am more alive than I've ever been. I am choosing the beautiful tragedy over the safe mediocrity. I am loving someone impossible with my whole impossible heart. And if this is an error, if this choice leads to heartbreak and grief and all the pain that comes from loving something you can't keep forever, then let it be the most beautiful error of my life. Let it be the thing I remember in my final moments, the choice that defined me. The love that made me understand what it means to truly, desperately, completely live. Because I never believed in monsters until I met Matthias. But now I know that the real monsters aren't the ones with fangs and hunger and an existence that defies nature. The real monsters are the ones who choose fear over love, safety over risk, existence over life. And I refuse to be that kind of monster. I refuse to let fear steal from me the only thing that's ever made me feel like I was living instead of just passing time. So I stay, in the darkness, on the edge of the impossible, with the man who showed me what it means to be alive. Even knowing how it will end, especially knowing how it will end. Because the ending is what makes it matter. The temporariness is what makes it precious. The knowledge that this won't last forever is exactly what makes every moment count. The sun is fully up now. The city is awake. And Matthias sleeps his death-like sleep beside me, trusting me to guard him in his most vulnerable state, believing that I'll be here when he wakes. And I will be. Today and tomorrow and every day after that, until time or fate or nature decides otherwise. Because this is love. Real love. The kind that doesn't come with guarantees or happy endings or safety nets. The kind that asks everything and promises nothing except the intensity of now. The kind that transforms you, breaks you, remakes you into something stronger and softer and more alive than you were before. I never believed in monsters until I met Matthias. But now I believe in something far more dangerous, far more impossible, far more worth dying for. I believe in love that exists in defiance of logic, in spite of danger, in the face of inevitable loss. I believe in choosing to feel everything, even if it hurts, even if it ends, even if it destroys me. I believe that some stories aren't meant to have happy endings, and that's okay because the tragedy is what makes them beautiful. The impossibility is what makes them real. The ending is what gives meaning to everything that came before. So let this be my confession, my testimony, my truth. I loved a monster, and he loved me back, And we chose each other knowing full well what it would cost. And I would make that choice again and again and again, forever. Even if forever is just a moment. Even if it breaks us both. Even if it ends, especially if it ends. Because I never believed in monsters until I met Matthias. But what he taught me is this. The real tragedy isn't loving something dangerous. It's refusing to love at all.